Cubs have a lot to work on, and we're going to solve all those issues. Well, maybe we'll try to do that here on the Cubs Baseball Channel. Got a great guest for you guys, Brett Taylor from Bleacher Nation. Make sure that you like and subscribe. Give us a thumbs up. Make some comments. Ask some questions. We're going to get this party started right now. Right after this open. All right. What do you say, man? Great to have you on. I read your stuff all the time, Brett, so it's awesome to have you here in person. You guys recognize him from Bleacher Nation. I'm like a regular on there, so it's really great to have you on here to talk about our team.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words, and it's all reflected back at you as well. And I was joking before that the only down part of this experience is that we've got to talk about the last 3 weeks of the Cubs, but everything else is delightful. So
yeah.
Happy to be here.
And both like lifelong Cubs fans too, I know there's a lot of our friends that are in the media that didn't grow up following the Cubs, which is what we did. And so that means that we're kind of along the same heartbreak.
Yes.
But also, at times it's not always being lovable losers, but it feels like over the last 40 years, it's been more than not.
Yeah, I try to remind myself, and I've had to do a lot more of it lately, that at those highest of highs, especially recently in the build-up in 2015, 2016, that if you'd asked me at the time, I would have said, oh man, I would trade 10, 20 miserable years after this if they can just go all the way this year. And, maybe this is the payoff for that. Maybe those dark deals that we made with the spirits, we're eating it now. Yeah.
This is the bad years because we finally won, right? Yeah. Right. Well, I guess let me throw this up here. First question. What is the Cubs' biggest issue in your mind, or issues with an S?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways to think about that question. Not even the multiple issues, but two ways to think about the question. One is, when you look at the roster and how they're using it, how they're deploying it, what could they be doing differently that they're not, right? That's one way to think of an issue. Another way is just like, what is the thing that's going wrong that is damaging them the most in terms of wins? And so that latter one is what's been on my mind mostly over the last month. And it actually, I was talking about this recently, it goes back to the final days of April, that since then, and it was, if people remember, the Cubs took first place in the Central for about like 6 hours on April 26th.
I remember that.
Sole possession. It was fun. It was like, all right. And they haven't seen it since. And from that moment on, not only have they been the worst performing team in baseball with runners in scoring position, they have been, it's almost hilarious how bad they have been. Their numbers, there's different ways you can calculate it, but right. The short version is they've been about 44% worse than the average team would be with runners in scoring position. And listen, we can get into what causes something like that, but that is the kind of thing that, while you wouldn't call it the only issue and the only cause of these losses, it is by far the heaviest weight and the heaviest drag, because those are the moments you need to score the most runs. And if you are performing so egregiously worse than the average team, you're going to have a lot of nights where you score 0, 1, 2 runs. And that's exactly what we've seen.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I feel like it's been this combination of taking advantage of opportunities when they have presented themselves at the plate, and then the bullpen.
Yeah, I think the problem, and we've seen this in years past too, we saw it a lot last year, frankly, is when you have an offense that is not blowing teams away. Or you've got starting pitching and offense in a combination that are like just good enough to keep games close. Any issues you have in the bullpen are going to be magnified. They're going to feel so much more painful because you're going to be experiencing those close games where you look at it and you're like, if they just hadn't given up that 1 run late, if that bleeder off of Mark Leiter Jr. hadn't gotten through, they would have won. Mm-hmm. And so there was a stretch during the same period where the offense was so brutal, where the Cubs bullpen was actually performing among the best in baseball. But it's hard to notice it because they're not getting 3-run leads to protect. They're getting tied games. They're getting 1-run leads. They're getting 1-run trailing. And they've had a lot of injuries, of course, in the bullpen as well. But certainly you couldn't point to the starting pitching as the problem, obviously, right? That's been going well. So you do have to look at those other phases. They've been disappointing on defense too. Base running's terrible. Like they do have a lot of issues.
Yeah. And that's like, we can talk about how good Seiya Suzuki is when you don't give him 10 days. I mean, Shota Imanaga is when you don't give him 10 days rest. Ben Brown almost threw a no-hitter. But the bottom line is that the team's not winning, so that's why you got to talk about the things that aren't going well. And when you're losing so many games that are close, you're right. Base running matters. And so does missing out on opportunities at the plate. And I agree with you. They were hitting at the beginning of the season, and they were one of the best hitting teams in baseball. And then all of a sudden, the injuries started to pile up. And what surprised me the most is when these guys have come back, they haven't performed, and it's like they were winning without them. But then it's just like we just had a pile of injuries, and then it got overwhelming, and now everyone's back, but they're just not healthy, or they're not playing well, or maybe they're just not kind of in tune anymore like they were when the season started. I don't know. What do you attribute?
Well, and there's a cascading effect too. Offense is it works together, right? The more opportunities you have, the more pressure you're putting on the opposing pitcher, then the better your other guys can perform and so forth. And so it does build on itself. And Cubs are obviously having issues with that. Craig Counsell has described it as not putting we haven't been putting enough pressure on the other teams, and we certainly see that. I think you're right. I think the injuries played a part, especially because when the offense was performing so poorly and guys were out, they're probably pushing to get back. And that isn't to say that they're not healthy now, but maybe they aren't fully back to where they could be. You also had a run of really good starting pitchers that the Cubs faced during the stretch. Like I get it. People hate to hear that reality, but the other team's trying to win too. So sometimes you do have to be honest that you might be facing a disproportionately excellent stretch of pitching. That was a factor, not the factor, a factor. And they've had terrible batted ball luck, which again, a factor, not the factor. I'm not saying it's the factor, but there are a lot of ways to analyze sort of the production you should be seeing on the basis of the quality of your contact, your walks, your strikeouts. And the Cubs have still been poor. Let's make no mistake about that, but they haven't been as bad as their results have been. And so that too, you add all of those things up, and that's what it has to be if you're going to be this bad for this long an offense. It's got to be a lot of things happening at once.
Yeah.
And that's what we're looking at.
Yeah, right. I mean, I start to what I always did was when I started doing games on Cubs.com, MLB.com, and I would go to spring training and I would look at the Cubs, and then like, okay, you got Derek Lee at first, and you got Terrio at second, Fontenot, you got Ramirez at third. You start looking into the outfield, and you're like, you got Alfonso Soriano in left, and then you go around and you're like, it's just a pretty good team, and then 2015, I'm like, okay, we got, Chris Bryant and Javi Baez and Rizzo, and then you get in the outfield. And when I look at what's going on this team, I'm looking at catcher. They're absolutely getting nothing out of the catcher spot at all. I mean, it's like old school 80s baseball where, they're just not. I mean, there's no production there. And then first base, Bush had that run where he hit all the home runs and everything. It was great. Now, all of a sudden, no production there. I'm fine with Nico at second. Dansby at shortstop, supposed to be your best player. You're paying him to be your best player, and he's an out. And I think defensively, you said it. I mean, he's been disappointing this year. We had a Gold Glove middle infield last year, so maybe he's still dealing with the knee injury. Morel hasn't hit anything since the foot, got hit by a foul ball in Atlanta, in my opinion. And I'm not in the training room, but I just know that since that day, he's been nothing. Then you look in the outfield, and it's like Hap has had a couple good games, but he's batting like 200. Bellinger's starting to get going again. Suzuki is starting to get going again, but a lot of problems as far as like just going position by position where guys just aren't producing.
Yeah, I think I liked your description of, you're in spring training and you're looking at all of the spots and you sort of like, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting on a team like this where I think if we're all honest with ourselves and you're looking at the group in spring training, it's not that you see obvious problems necessarily. It's more like you see, well, this spot could be good if this, and this spot could be good if this. And what happens is sometimes the other end of the spectrum happens, right? Like Miguel Amaya and Jan Gomes behind the plate, right? Didn't have to be terrible. It didn't have to go the way it is going, but sometimes this is the outcome. Sometimes an older catcher kind of hits that wall, and I think we might be seeing that with Jan Gomes. Sometimes a younger catcher is working so hard to develop his rhythm with a pitching staff in the big leagues that he can't focus on offense. It's a very taxing thing to be
Yeah, good
doing.
point.
And we're seeing, I think, like the lowest percentile outcome from behind the plate, and that's just an example. Because I think you're right. It is hard now to look at the collection of position players and say this is going to be a great offense. I don't think that even when sort of the luck evens out, the runners in scoring position thing evens out. I don't see this becoming a great offense, but it certainly doesn't have to be well below average. This
Yeah,
can be an
right.
average offense, but that only works. So say they do get back to being like an average offense. The idea is that this was going to be a really good defensive team, and it was going to be led by a quality pitching staff. And the pitching and defense thing only works if the defensive component is complying. And right now, it it's passable in a lot of spots, but it's not impactful in a lot of spots. And that's, I think, going to continue to be an issue.
Yeah. Well, I look at the minor leagues and I go, okay, is there anyone that can help bring a spark? Because the thing that concerns me the most is that I just feel like they play flat so much. They just, Luis Vasquez scores the run in the extra inning win they has. He's up, he's fired up. He scored on the ball that hit the pitcher and bounced away. And that opened up the only really good offensive inning I feel like the team's had in forever. And then we send him back to the minor leagues, right? It's like, it's not always about. So Joe Madden was a master of this, right? Where you're not just bringing up players and throwing them on the bench, you're bringing them up and you're trying to take their energy and their excitement and their enthusiasm. The fact that they're a little wide-eyed because they're going out there and they're giving everything they have, and the older players, they've played so many games, maybe they don't always feel that. And I look at, Pete Crow Armstrong, they sent him down. I thought that was a bad idea. I'm looking at Owen Casey right now, and I'm going, I see the guy hit a home run every time I turn around. I saw him last year every game. He's a difference maker. Maybe you say, hey, we want a guy in right field that can catch, make some moves. I don't know, but he's definitely an option. I saw people in the comment section talking about that. In your mind, what kind of moves could they make? And I'm not talking about David Bodie for Nick Madrigal. I'm talking about like what kind of bold moves could they make that you think, and don't talk trades. I mean, I'm just in the organization now that could help this team.
Yeah, because the trade stuff, for as much as people like to talk about it and like to be excited about it, it's just not happening until July. It's just
right.
It's not going to happen, especially with this team struggling the way they are. This front office is not going to send out a bunch of talent to try to float what's happening. They want to see what's going to happen with this group and see if it justifies adding significantly in July. So we'll get there when we get there. So I think you're right, Nick. If the Cubs are going to change things, it's going to happen internally. I think we should credit the Pete Crow Armstrong move in this way. So when they sent him down initially, I didn't love it. I thought the better approach would be to sort of figure out a way to incorporate him more. It was both for his development and because Cody Bellinger was feeling back to 100%. And so it's like, okay, well, he's going to be starting every day. So I appreciate that they recognized the minimum stint that he had to be optioned. Like, okay, actually, we need him back. And they're going to figure out how to rotate guys around to make sure they can try to get that impact from him. So I think that's going to be the type of thing they have to do because so Owen Casey as an example. So love him. I think he's going to be a very good bat long term in the big leagues. Let's say we get past the part where you're worried about his development, where you don't think he'll be negatively impacted by coming up now, right? Thinking through how you would coordinate the playing time for him is tricky, right? Because you've got corner outfielders in Ian Happ and Seiya Suzuki who are everyday players, not just in name. They're everyday players because they're pretty good. They've got a pretty good track record of producing,
and they're paid for that too.
And they also have experience that could potentially pay off as a team is starting to spiral. Maybe a young player doesn't handle that as well. So you'd have to figure that out, right? You got first base where the Cubs want Michael Busch to be the guy, right? They paid pretty heavily in trade to get him to be that guy. And so you want to give him a full and fair run. And you have the DH spot where you're often having to put Christopher Morel because defensively at third, it's been a challenge. But you also have to reserve that spot for when you want to rotate Busch to DH so that Bellinger can play first base, so that PCA can play center.
Right.
And then it starts to become very constricted on how you would get those everyday starts for someone like Owen Casey. That said, and I should add, because we saw that like with Alexander Canario, right? Like when he was up, he could do some things. He could do some positive things, but there just wasn't the playing time. And with Casey, I think he's going to have to just be like, it's going to almost have to be a joke that he's still at AAA for the Cubs to pull that particular trigger and essentially sit down Michael Busch. That's kind of how they would have to do it.
Right.
I don't know that we're there yet. And so I struggle a bit to see where that internal impact is going to come from, both because of who's available and because of how the current big league group coordinates playing time. And they said these, Jed has kind of said to some extent, and I think Craig Counsell has echoed it, that if they're going to succeed this summer, it's going to have to be the guys who have succeeded before, and who are there to do it, and they aren't right now as a group, certainly. But sometimes you live and die by the guys that you have constructed a team to carry you.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess the next thing I'm going to ask you is, when do you see that happening? And how far do you go down before you say, hey, man, you know what? This is another one of those seasons where, let me say this, 49% now is the percentage that the Cubs have to make the playoffs, right? And I look at that stuff, and it's not perfect, but it does give you an idea that now it's become 50-50 that the Cubs make the postseason. It was 50-50 or better most of last year, and they didn't make it. So they ended up underperforming according to, all of the percentages. So what's it going to take, and when are these? How far do we go down before we start to panic?
And we know the front office pays attention to that stuff. We know they said it last year that like there are times when you can no longer justify doing X or Y because the chances of us making the playoffs are not there. I think you hear frequently that the All-Star break is a big cutoff point for these teams that are on the fence. Certainly with respect to a buy-sell decision at the trade deadline comes 2 weeks later, and I think what we're seeing, what's interesting is in this newer era with the expanded playoff pool, more teams are taking that decision later and later because more teams have a chance to make the postseason, and they don't necessarily want to pick a lane until they have to. What's interesting about this year's Cubs team in relation to that, because this roster is not necessarily constructed to sell, there's not really a lot of pieces that make sense to trade away as it has in other years. We can get into the particulars on that, but there's just not a lot of the right.
You're talking about like Bellinger last year was on a 1-year deal. It would have been so easy to move him out and you would have got a boatload of players for him if you'd have made that deal, but you decided to go all in. So you didn't make that trade.
Exactly. And so this year don't really have those same pieces, including Bellinger, because his contract, the way it's structured, he's not really tradable for value. And I don't know if the Cubs want to move him anyway, but because they aren't set up that way, they kind of have the ability to say, look, we don't have to commit. We can literally take this thing straight up to the end of July and then decide if we're going to buy a little bit or just hold. Uh, so I think for as frustrating as it might wind up being for a lot of us fans, I think this is just going to be what it is for the next month and a half, 2 months, and then a decision will be made. And I got a feeling we're going to know. We're going to look at where they are in the standings and just sort of as a team, and know if it is worth parting with significant prospect talent to try to bolster certain areas. And I guess we should add to that end, the Cubs have a very deep farm system right
Mhm.
now. And that not only affords you the ability to buy when you need to, but it also does become a consideration that you're not going to be able to develop all of those players. There's not going to be minor league playing time for all of your players with
Great
new
point.
new roster limits. And so at some point, Cubs are going to almost have to make certain moves.
Yeah.
And that'll probably factor in. But I think what you would see is if the Cubs are not super competitive come July, if they're making deals, they would be longer term. They would sort of be prospect swapping kind of thing, as opposed to true buying rental type deals.
Right. Going out and getting Pete Alonso and bringing the polar bear in,
Exactly.
to play first base. Well, I got to ask you this because I'm reading all the comments as we're talking. And if the Cubs don't make the playoffs, is Jed Hoyer's job safe? Because I know that's what no one's asked that particular question, but you guys, you put a lot of the emphasis of success and failure on Jed Hoyer, and he's the team president. Last year, they didn't make it. You got rid of your manager. You went out and got the best manager. I think the best manager that was available in the last 10 years. He's great. And still, we're kind of in the same spot we were in last year. Feels a lot like last year. Do you think that he's got anything to worry about, or would it be okay if you wait until July and nothing happens, and then all of a sudden, you end up a game or two or even further back? There were pretty high expectations that this year was going to be a year that, went out and spent all that money, that this team was going to win.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing to talk about because we haven't had this as a discussion point for many, many years, right? Because Cubs brought in Theo Epstein, never going to fire Theo Epstein, and then Jed Hoyer is his successor. That's the same tree. I think a lot of Cubs fans saw Jed as an extension of Theo, which is not necessarily fair because they're very different. There's some differences in their styles, but so this really isn't a question we've had to confront for over a decade. And I think some of it's outside our purview because we don't exactly know the relationship between Jed and Tom Ricketts, and there may be reasons that he'd be completely safe or completely not that we just aren't going to have access to. But in terms of evaluating performance, I think reaching the playoffs in a certain timeline, like 3.5 years or whatever it's been since Jed took over, I personally don't like using that as a benchmark of whether you're going to make a sweeping change. And there's two reasons for that. One, I don't like the idea of front office executives acting out of desperation to save their own job. It's like, oh my God, I got to get a wild card this year or I'm going to be fired. And then you make decisions that are bad long term.
Great point. And that is a great point, people. I'm telling you, I don't want to even get into this, but to slow you down. But what he is saying right there is 110% accurate.
Yeah. We've seen in other organizations, we've seen what can happen.
It's happened here too.
And so, and so that's one part of it. The other is I'm a very process oriented person. So I'd rather evaluate what I'm seeing top to bottom through an organization in saying, is this person and the people that he's hired, are they succeeding in making an organization that is closer significantly to being successful every year? Like, I know it became kind of a running joke, that sustained success thing they brought in, but that is really what you want. It's what every organization wants, is that you're coming into every season knowing that you've got a chance to make the playoffs, because that's just what you have constructed as an organization. You don't want these cycles of like, you compete for 5 years and then it's down again. And then fans don't want that. And so I'd rather, reserve judgment till we get into September. And like, I could envision scenarios where the Cubs stink, they're out of it, they're 20 games back. And yet I look at the organization and I say, you know what? I think things are looking really good, and here's why. Or I can envision a scenario where they make the playoffs this year, and I say, yeah, but I have significant concerns, and I think
Mhm.
maybe it might be time to think about whether this is working. Um, I think so. To answer it all another way, I think the fact that we're even having this conversation now kind of says a lot.
Yeah, good point. Man, I'm with you, man. You're fired. You're killing it today, man. I totally feel what you're throwing out there, and I agree with you. I mean, like, and that's what happens. These guys will make trades, and you're going, "What are we doing?" And it's because they're like, "If I make the playoffs, we're going to keep everyone's job." But the problem with that is that you got to make decisions that are based on what's going to be best for the organization long term. And that's why you can't really have these GMs and presidents that are on the bubble. You could trade some of these guys that the Cubs have in their system, the Owen Caseys and the Pete Crow Armstrongs and James Triantoses, the guys that are going to make a difference for you, and then they'll go somewhere else and you won't have them. And it's like you look at the other team and you're like, hey, how come we had Josh Donaldson? We don't have him anymore. I mean, and not picking on anybody, but that's the tough part of doing that job. And when you make decisions because you're worried about trying to keep your job, you might not make the best decision for the long scale in the organization. And that's what I think those are going to be questions that he's going to have to answer, because you're right. There's a lot of depth. And you made a great point. There's guys who can play, but they're all like stacked up in AAA and they're not going to get a chance because there's so many guys there, so you're not going to develop as many. So you've got to be good at internally evaluating your talent, and that's scouting and that's being honest about how a player plays and what they do, and not falling in love with your own guys, but also not overlooking anyone, and great organizations like the Braves and the Oakland A's seem to be amazing at doing that.
Yeah, internal self-scouting is just it's a thing that, like, I feel like people don't talk about, that is so critically important. And for example, we're seeing it play out now, and I'm not throwing stones, I'm not criticizing, but like, you look at the success that Jeremiah Estrada is having with the Padres, right?
Yeah.
Instant explosive success. And we knew, and the Cubs knew all along, that the talent was there, right? The fastball could be what it is. The slider could be what it is. And I don't fault the Cubs for pulling back in 2023 when it was he couldn't locate anything. It was not working. Now, where it's fair to question is when they decided in the offseason that his was a 40-man spot that they could sacrifice, that there were other guys they preferred to keep. You have to question in those moments, did we miss something? Did we self-scout poorly on this? Or did the Padres just, it was the right fit? Because sometimes guys go somewhere else. It was never going to happen here for a variety of reasons. And you don't beat yourself up too badly in those situations, but you need to be honest. You need to really look at those spots and say, okay, you know what? Here's what we missed. Let's improve from it. Let's not make that same type of mistake again. Because a lot of organizations do. We've seen it on the other side of it, right? Where the Cubs will get a change of scenery guy who then has tremendous success.
Yeah, right.
You don't think about the two sides of that coin, right? You're just like, man, the Cubs are awesome at turning Jake Arrieta into Jake Arrieta, but you don't think too much about the Orioles having to be like, well, what did we do wrong? Where did we miss? What could we have done differently? And so I think the best organizations, like you said, are really good at knowing what they have, knowing what they don't, knowing what they are experts at, what they're not, and making good decisions internally, much less the ones that get the headlines, the big signings, the big trades.
Yeah. That Estrada, well, that's a tough one. But then you go, well, look at Leiter. Look at Merriweather, those relievers. It's just like they just turn around and like they float from one team to the next, And then I gotta tell you, I was glad to see Tyson Miller come back, and he's actually been pretty good.
Yeah,
we need about 3 more of those guys, and I think there could be some in the system right now, but we'll see who they're willing and able to make a move to bring up, because the other part of it is figuring out who you have on your 40-man. If you take Brendan Davis off and he goes somewhere else and he turns into Garcia of the Rangers, then you're killing yourself for that. But then at the same time, it's like, how many years are you going to have this guy on the 40-man and not in the big leagues?
Yep. And that's one of those things where it's not like we're saying it's easy. We're not saying these decisions are obvious. But that is the job. That's a big part of the job. And I think you are right to, Brendan Davis is a great example of just a very, very difficult 40-man discussion, because we know what the talent is. We know what he can be. We know there's still development that needs to happen. It was interrupted by the injuries. So how much of that is fluky, and how much is that affect his trajectory? And again, I wouldn't put myself in the seat to try to make that decision. It's hard. But that's what the job is. And so I think it will be fascinating as so much of this young talent percolates up. You were right to point to that AA to AAA group. There are so many guys that just are going to need playing time, going to need spots. And the Cubs are going to have to make some very difficult decisions about who to retain, who to move on, who to put on the 40-man, who to expose to the Rule 5 draft in the next 2 years that are going to be very difficult.
A lot of questions about Dansby Swanson. Some people were calling him Dansby Hayward on the chat board today. Should we be concerned with Dansby right now?
Well, and that comparison is not entirely unfair in at least this respect. When the Cubs signed Jason Hayward to the deal they did, much of that was built upon his floor, right? He was still young, and he was an elite defensive right fielder, and you sort of rightly or wrongly assume that won't change. That's at worst, he might be a light hitting Gold Glove right fielder for 8 years. So let's do it. Of course, these are humans, so things do change, and performances that you can't fathom happening below a certain threshold, they do happen sometimes. And so I have a feeling that there was a lot of conversations about the Jason Hayward deal, and thinking through that process of what got them there, and what, how much of that then went into signing Dansby Swanson, who, although he didn't have the youth part of it, he very much had that floor of an elite defensive shortstop. And you sort of think, okay, well, he's not going to be a guy who carries us on offense necessarily, but and he'll age. As guys get in their 30s, and there's a degradation of skill at defensive positions. That's just in the aggregate, not every single person, but in the aggregate that happens. I'm getting old too. I'm telling you, it happens. And so I will wonder if he can bounce back from, if the knee was limiting him. I wonder too, a lot of our evaluation of defensive performance is based on some imperfect stuff, like errors. That's a very visible thing, right? But then we know that that's kind of fluky based on who gets to what ball. And
right,
if there's a scoop at first base, suddenly you didn't make an error. But if there's not a scoop at first base, oh, well, that was terrible. And he's got a playing partner.
Great. That's
third.
a great. Well, hold on. I've got to say this. People think that you just throw anybody at first base. You don't win Gold Gloves having Patrick Wisdom as your first baseman. I'm just going to tell you guys that you win them with guys like Anthony Rizzo or Derek Lee, or actually Bellinger was really good last year.
Fantastic.
So surprising to me. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, you're fine. That's one of those thoughts I always have rolling around in my head. I'll see a play, right? It's a great play, throw over to first, and it's dug out, and somebody might say like, oh, good scoop, but nobody thinks about the fact that exact same play could have been an error. If for the shortstop, if the first baseman didn't scoop it. And so there's probably some of that too going on, that you have a relatively new defender there at third base that affects what balls you get to, how you're positioned. Maybe Dansby's being asked to do a lot more this year at shortstop to try to cover that. He's got a new first baseman who's adjusting. I have seen some throws that maybe a different first baseman would have corralled. So that's a factor. And then you got the knee, and you just wonder, how serious was it? How much is it limiting him now? That's very hard to evaluate in a small period. And then you've got advanced defensive metrics that'll tell you something. But I gotta caution everyone. Unlike a lot of other advanced stats, the defensive metrics, they're just not super reliable in a small sample. And a small sample for advanced defensive metrics is like anything less than a season. It is very hard to get really good meaning from that. So I would be cautious about worrying too much about Dansby Swanson's defense yet. As far as the bat goes, I don't know. I mean, we knew there was going to be some decline. We knew he wasn't signed to be this offensive force. It's just magnified because everyone else is struggling.
Yeah,
He's
good point.
he's like a 7, 8, 9 hitter on a good, really good team.
Yeah.
But on this team, we're expecting more. And so, hey, the contract's a year shorter than Jason Hayward. So there you go. There's your relief. It's
Yeah.
you at worst, you'll be spared the final year.
There you go. Brett, hanging out with us from Bleacher Nation. If you guys have a question, throw it in the chat. I'm going to ask him one more and then take a couple of yours, and then we'll get out of here. So let's talk about something really cool, and that is Shota Imanaga. How amazing. I thought the way that he had entered Chicago was great, knowing that he was just kicking it around the city, figuring out where he wanted to play, going to a hockey game. He comes in and on, regular pitchers rest, he's been fantastic. Now with the 10-day rest, not the same guy. But how amazing has it been to see the Shota mania, like Fernando mania?
Just blew away. Even if someone had told you in the offseason that this is what this guy was going to do, you would have said you're being dangerously over optimistic and you are foolish. And so this has just dramatically outpaced anything that we could have expected. Now he's doing things we thought were possible. Like there were reasons to think his fastball could be very effective if he could learn and develop the ability to command the upper third of the zone, which is very different than the way the game is played in Japan. And he obviously has, and that's been really fun to see. It's really fun when a guy is throwing 92 and he's just blowing it by hitters. We knew the splitter was very, very good, and he can move it around, which is very impressive for a pitch that notoriously difficult to command. But just the overall success, the results, and the level to which he's deserved the results he's getting is just it blew me away. It blew everyone away. If you said you saw this coming, you're such a liar. And so, to me, even with the down start in Milwaukee, the 10 days rest, he said it was not a factor. Player probably always going to say that. But I think about the fact that in Japan, they pitch once a week, and he pitched once a week, so he always had 6 full days between starts. And here in the States, it's 4 or 5. So he was already kind of having to adjust his routine and his schedule, and was used to some of those longer layoffs. So I think it's more, he made some mistakes in that start. He missed some spots. He didn't execute some pitches as well as he has been. And the Brewers were on all of them, which that won't always happen. You'll have days where you are not executing pitches well. You're not locating. And the hitters just sort of miss. I feel like the Cubs bats have been doing that to some guys lately.
Right.
And, it was one where both of those things were happening. And so he got kind of blown up. And I think we're going to see some of that throughout the year, because he was never going to continue to be a sub-1 ERA guy, right? Like, that's not going to happen. But I think we all should raise our hopes for what he could be over a full season. I think it's very fair now to hope that he's, a really good front half of the rotation guy.
Yeah. I mean, and it's really crazy just remembering, when Fernando was in LA, and I was really young, but I may remember that. And then how big of an impact he had on Major League Baseball, and to think that Shota's first 9 games were slightly better than Fernando, and all of the people that he brings into the Cubs audience. The Cubs have 2 of the best Japanese players on the team right now in the country. Now they're not, Ohtani, but I'll tell you what, they're really fun players to watch when you look at it. And I saw where one of our questions from Rob was asking about positioning for Seiya. Do you think that he should be DH right fielder, or do you think, is his defense that bad where you worry about it, or do you like the role he has right now?
Yeah, so speaking of those defensive metrics, he generally rates out as an average right fielder. I think what's happening is he's had some really bad mistakes out there that magnifies, and we remember those. And so it kind of makes a guy seem a certain way. And he doesn't really have flashy plays. He hasn't really made, I'm trying to think of like the big crazy diving catch that he's made, or the, absolutely rocket armed someone down at the plate. And those are few and far between. Plus, you had the fact that when he came in, he had won multiple Gold Gloves in Japan, and so that was part of the expectations. Is I think we thought we were going to see a guy out in right field that was a lot better than he was. Plus, hey, we were down on Hayward earlier, but let me just say he is a very good defender. So we were used to seeing one of the best in right field. I think that all plays into the perception. When I don't think he's terrible out there, I just think he's okay. I think he's fine. He's passable. If you had a circumstance where you had a better defensive right fielder available and that DH spot was open, yeah, let's have that conversation. I think, I think that I don't see who that is right now. I mean, it would be, frankly, is if Michael Busch was just killing it and you decided you had to play PCA every day and you had to play Cody Bellinger every day. One way you could do that is move Cody to right field, PCA play center, and say at DHs. I think there's a reticence right now to lock in anyone at DH full time.
Yeah.
I think Craig Counsell likes to use that as the half day off, kind of rotate guys. So for now, I'm not trying to argue with anyone about say his defense in right field. I'm just saying for me personally, it's like it's okay, it's fine.
You can live with it if you have to.
Yeah, I can live with it right now.
Yeah. Jake once says that we're giving up on Michael Busch too quickly, Cubs fans, and there are a lot of comments for people are giving up. Matt Mervis, kind of another guy that was young and came up and didn't have the success that Busch had, but he hasn't played a lot lately and he hasn't produced a whole lot lately.
Yeah, it's been interesting. He has started to get some days off especially now that PCA is back, he started to get some days off that you would think he would be in the lineup for. And I don't want to make any kind of pronouncements that like Craig Counsell's thinking has changed. It might just be give a young player a breather. But I think you'd be very premature if you were deciding now that like he can't be a big league hitter. I think we're way too early on that. But I will note he's 26. He's on the older side for a quote young player, because the Cubs do have some other bats coming. This is maybe a 25 conversation, not a 24 conversation, but he is going to have a relatively short window of time to demonstrate that he's definitely the bat the Cubs hoped he could be when they made the trade that they did. I think there are certain reasons, from a scouting and an analysis perspective, why his leash will be longer than it was for Matt Mervis, for example. But as we saw with Matt Mervis, there does come a point where if you're trying to be competitive, you can't wait forever for a player to get his feet under him. And with Busch, I'm not there yet, two months or whatever into his Cubs career, but I do think it's something you have to evaluate over the course of this season.
Yeah, great stuff. Well, let's talk about you a little bit, man. I said at the beginning of the show how much I enjoy your work, and then I read your stuff on Twitter constantly. I mean, constantly refreshing. How did you get into this business? Tell us about your finding your love for the Cubs, and how long have you been covering them, and how much do you enjoy it outside of losing like we have lately?
I was going to say there are better days.
Yeah.
So I grew up a Cubs fan from, more or less day one. My dad's family was from the Chicago area, and I'm in Ohio, but he kind of brought that love of Chicago sports and baseball in particular to me growing up. And I had WGN available, of course, to watch Cubs games after school. So I got hooked. And
Harry and Steve, was it Harry and Steve?
Oh yeah.
Okay, and me too.
Yeah, the 89 team was probably my first where I was like, oh, I really like this
Mark
thing.
Grace.
And so that stuck. And I was always sort of active in the early internet days of Cubs message boards and things like that. And just kind of always was part of that community. But I was a lawyer for a while and had, a day job and was doing that. And so I started writing Bleacher Nation just for fun on the side, kind of to scratch the itch. And I was very fortunate that it kind of got a bit of a following, and I was able to make it a full-time job. Now, it's about 13 years ago, I moved over to doing it full-time.
When did you know? When did you know it was time?
I mean, part of it honestly was life circumstances. Like we had a kid, it was our first baby, and so the lawyer job that I had was not as conducive, sort of, with my personality. It was kind of it was a large law firm, and culturally it was hard. I'm a very light guy, and so some of the ways that you had to be successful just didn't mesh with my personality. And I frankly I looked at the market for what I might be able to achieve. I actually made a PowerPoint for my wife to, to convince her to let me leave the lawyer life and do this full time. And I felt very confident that if I spent as much time doing this as I did being a lawyer, I could maybe carve something out. And I will tell you, and I will say, I got very lucky that was the summer of 2011. And if folks remember what was going on in summer 2011, that was when Jim Hendry was on his way out, and the great Theo search and rumor was on. So I did get a big boost because I kind of covered that obsessively. And then we grew from there and added some other guys to cover other Chicago sports, and it's been my thing since then.
Yeah. You do a great job. Yeah. I was interested, like, because you start this stuff and you do it, and then all of a sudden it's like, man, it takes up. Well, you guys are watching. You don't even realize how much time it takes to throw something like this together, or to do, cover it, like to be on top of every single move that happens. I try to do it on here, with the videos, and it's like, do I do a whole show for this? Do I just do like one little quick short video? Do I ignore it? It's are people going to watch it? Are they going to like it?
It's extra hard for guys like you and me who are, like you said, really passionate Cubs fans, because then you're like, your professional life is married to your fandom and your happiness. And like, it can make an extra challenging thing that you can't sort of take that hat off.
Yeah, well, that too. Yeah, no doubt, man. And I know most of these guys we're talking about, so for me, I mean, when I'm talking about Jed, I really like him. I'm going to tell you, just as a person, like, I like being around him. It's not like I'm hanging out with him a lot, but when I see him, he's always just really nice. Like, he goes out of his way to talk to you. Remembers the conversation that you had before. You talk about a lot of stuff that's not baseball related. This has been, just personally, watching Kyle Hendricks struggle and have to be honest about the fact that I feel like it's probably over for him sucks, because I like him. Like, I've known him since he got in with the Cubs, and I pull for that guy. But then there's this other part of it where you're like, hey, man, I can't come on here and be taken seriously if I don't say that the guy he just doesn't have it anymore. I mean, when he gets outs, you're like, oh my gosh, you're like, every single pitch is potentially a home run, I feel like, but that's here nor there. It's like, you really want these guys to succeed, and then when you got to come on here and do this, it's the same thing, like,
yeah,
how do you balance that?
Oh, and if you ever hear from like a prospect's parents, and it's like, oh, I don't want to know. I want to, you want that line in between. And yeah, it's tough, because especially, again, if you are I think, a nice person, it's like you care about other people. You want them to be happy and successful. And so it is hard to divorce yourself from that enough to evaluate honestly and comment sincerely on these things.
Well, look, I had a great time hanging out with you. I appreciate you doing this. If come on and do it more often. This was a lot of fun. I know our fans will like this conversation, guys. If you missed any of it, you can go back and rewatch it, and make sure that you like and subscribe, but also make sure that you check out Bleacher Nation. I check out your stuff daily on X or Twitter or whatever, but kind of throw out there how people can follow you and, and keep up with the Cubs through you.
Yeah, sure. And thanks. I should add too, I love what you do, Mick, and I appreciate you having me on here anytime. Just holler at me. Yeah, so you can, if you want to see my stuff, like Mick mentioned, on Twitter, I'm not going to call it X, Twitter, at Bleacher Nation. I handle that account, and I do the Cubs coverage primarily at bleachernation.com. You can go to the Cubs section and you'll see my stuff. And Michael Cerami does a lot too. Got to shout out Michael because he's fantastic. But yeah, that's where you'll find us.
All right, guys. Hey, like and subscribe again. Thank you for hanging out. Comment section. You guys did a great job. Love reading all of your stuff. Dansby Hayward. That's my takeaway from today's show, other than hanging out with you. Hopefully we're wrong on that. It's only been, give the guy credit. He had a good season last year. So he's struggling, but Cubs take on the Sox tonight. The perfect time to play the White Sox when they're we're trying to help them get to their record. We just want them to get there.
I'm so sorry I busted out laughing, only because to me it's like there's no upside, because if the Cubs beat them down, it's like, okay, well, that's expected because these White Sox are terrible. If, God forbid, the Cubs were to lose both of these games against the White Sox, it's like, oh, so that's why I laugh.
Yeah. And we got mania going, right? We got Shota Mania back.
Cannot lose that game.
We can't lose, man. I mean, no pressure, guys, but you better get out there and win these next two games. We got to get them to 16 losses in a row so that they set their franchise record. All right. Well, Brett, thank you. And thank all of you guys. I'm Mick Gillispie. Again, go Cubs.